The final whistle has blown. The tourists are leaving. Atlanta's streets look cleaner, the barricades are coming down, and the city can say it survived the world's biggest spotlight. But the people told to move did not disappear when the cameras turned away. They still had to sleep somewhere.
But what I can say confidently is criminalization and bus tickets are in no way a part of our plan to address homelessness. We have never used those tactics to address homelessness. We will not be using those tactics during World Cup, nor will we be using them beyond the World Cup.
Atlanta says hundreds of people were placed into housing before the World Cup. Yet others say they were pushed from downtown, forced to rebuild a few miles away, or returned to find tents, medicine, and identification gone. So what really happened? Did the World Cup push Atlanta to build a more humane path out of homelessness? Or did it simply create a deadline to make the crisis less visible? Now that the world has stopped watching, the real test begins. For weeks, Atlanta had one job: show the world a city that was ready. 8 World Cup matches brought global attention to Mercedes-Benz Stadium, including a semifinal. Hundreds of thousands of fans moved through downtown, filled hotels, packed trains, and gathered around Centennial Olympic Park. By the end of the tournament, more than 500,000 people had attended Atlanta's Fan Fest, while a similar number had watched matches inside the stadium. From the television cameras, the picture looked controlled. Streets were busy but orderly. Transit systems carried record crowds. The skyline, the stadium, and the city's new developments presented Atlanta as a modern capital of the American South. That image mattered. 30 years earlier, when Atlanta hosted the 1996 Olympic Games, the city became notorious for the way it handled homelessness. Thousands of homeless people were arrested in the period surrounding the Games, triggering lawsuits and accusations that Atlanta had tried to remove poverty from public view rather than confront it. City leaders did not want the World Cup to reopen that wound. This time, Atlanta promised a different approach. The city invested tens of millions of dollars in Downtown Rising, a program designed to move people from sidewalks and encampments into transitional or permanent housing. Officials said hundreds had already received housing before the first World Cup match began. That was real progress. For people who received keys, a bed, and a door they could lock, the program was not a public relations exercise. It changed the basic conditions of their lives. But major events create two very different clocks. Housing someone safely can take months. Clearing a sidewalk can take a morning. And as the opening match approached, Atlanta was under pressure to deliver visible results on a deadline the entire world could see. Tourist corridors had to be open. Public spaces had to appear safe. Encampments near downtown could no longer be treated as background scenery. The city said it was offering housing, not simply removing tents. Yet beneath the elevated highways, residents were still living among mattresses, shopping carts, rotting food, human waste, and the constant noise of traffic overhead. To understand whether Atlanta's strategy was truly different, we have to leave the polished image created for the World Cup and go beneath the connector. Beneath the downtown connector, Atlanta's polished World Cup image gave way to something far harder to control. On Bell Street, just over a mile from Mercedes-Benz Stadium, tents and old mattresses filled the space beneath the interstate. Torn clothes, rotting food, and human waste had collected behind concrete barriers. Rodents moved through the debris. In places, the sidewalk was almost impossible to use. This was not simply an image problem. Grady Memorial Hospital stood just north of the encampment. Apartments were located nearby. Patients, hospital workers, residents, and pedestrians had to move through an area that city officials described as a serious public health concern. The people living there were also trapped inside those same conditions. One of the last residents was Hexania Zander, who had been sleeping in a green tent beneath the bridge since late 2025. Sitting on an old couch, surrounded by debris, she reduced the entire policy debate to 5 words: "I don't have a choice." For months, outreach workers said they had been visiting the site, identifying regular residents, and attempting to connect them with housing shelters, medical care, and transportation. Officials said the operation was delayed until housing placements became available. That distinction matters. A dangerous encampment should not be romanticized. People should not be expected to live beside waste pests, speeding traffic, and blocked sidewalks. Nearby residents should not be told that every concern about safety or sanitation is an attack on homeless people. But closing a dangerous camp creates another question. Where does everyone go? Some residents accepted housing or transportation, others remained uncertain until the final hours. Xander said previous shelter experiences had been unpleasant and that despite everything around her, she felt safer beneath the bridge. That may appear irrational from the outside, but a shelter can mean surrendering a pet, separating from a partner following a curfew that conflicts with work, or abandoning belongings that represent everything someone still owns. By Saturday morning, the tents were gone. Workers in protective suits loaded debris into trucks. Police planned additional patrols to stop the site from forming again. For commuters, the problem appeared to be solved. For the people who had lived there, the real measure was not whether Bell Street looked cleaner. It was whether they had somewhere safer to remain after the crews left. Atlanta insisted this closure followed a newer, more humane process. That promise existed because one earlier cleanup had already shown what could happen when a city treated a tent as debris before making certain no human being was still inside. Cornelius Taylor was 46 years old when a city cleanup reached the old Wheat Street encampment in January 2025. The site sat near Ebenezer Baptist Church only days before Atlanta's Martin Luther King Jr. holiday events. Public works crews had arrived with heavy equipment to remove tents and debris from an area the city considered unsafe. Taylor was still inside one of those tents. A city vehicle moved through the encampment, crushed the structure, and left him critically injured. He later died at a hospital. For his family and advocates, this was not an unavoidable accident. A wrongful death lawsuit later alleged that workers failed to confirm whether the tents were occupied before the equipment moved forward. The city has not accepted that legal claim, and the case remains contested. But one fact was no longer debatable. A cleanup intended to restore public space had ended with a human being dead. Taylor's death changed the political meaning of every encampment closure that followed. Atlanta temporarily paused the use of heavy machinery during sweeps. The city council called for procedures to be reviewed. A 36-member task force brought together city departments, service providers, health professionals, faith organizations, and housing advocates to examine how encampments should be closed without repeating the same failure. The recommendations were practical, not symbolic. Residents should receive advance notice. Outreach and housing offers should begin before the closure date. Multiple workers should check every tent. Thermal sweeps and visual tags could help identify occupied structures. Designated spotters should monitor the operation while equipment is moving. And after a site is closed, teams should continue watching the area rather than assuming the crisis ended when the last truck left. These changes made later operations safer on paper. They also revealed something uncomfortable. The danger was never only the machine. A city can verify that every tent is empty and still leave people with nowhere stable to go. It can complete every safety checklist while pushing the same residents from one underpass to another. Preventing another death during a sweep is essential, but it is not the same as ending homelessness. By the time Atlanta prepared for the World Cup, officials said the new process would combine safety outreach and housing first principles. The next test was whether those protections worked in practice and whether the city's housing program could move as quickly as its deadline. Atlanta's strongest answer to accusations of displacement was Downtown Rising. The initiative did not begin with police tape or sanitation trucks. Outreach teams created a list of people sleeping throughout downtown, assessed their needs, and attempted to match each person with permanent supportive housing, transitional apartments, medical care, or other services. The original downtown goal was ambitious: identify roughly 400 people living unsheltered and help them obtain stable housing before the World Cup arrived. By April 2026, Partners for Home reported that more than 450 people had already been housed. By early June, reporting placed the number near 500. Those were not merely tents removed from a sidewalk. They were people such as Jordan Barron, who had lived at an encampment on Ellis Street before receiving an apartment at Waterworks Village. They were people who could finally leave medication in one place, attend an appointment without guarding every possession, and sleep without expecting to be ordered somewhere else before morning. Atlanta also completed approximately 500 rapid housing units as part of its broader homelessness campaign. City officials presented the program as evidence that a major international event could accelerate humane investment instead of mass arrests. And they had a point. Without the World Cup deadline, some of those apartments might have taken longer to fund, construct, or occupy. Political pressure can produce real benefits when it forces institutions to act faster. But a housing placement is the beginning of the test, not the end. Stable housing requires more than handing someone a key. A resident may need mental health treatment, addiction services, transportation, income assistance, help, obtaining identification or support, rebuilding relationships damaged during years of instability. The available public reports celebrated how many people entered housing. They offered far less information about how many remained housed 6 months later, how many left voluntarily, or how many returned to shelters and streets. That does not prove the program failed. It means the most important outcome had not yet been fully measured in public. There was another limitation. Downtown Rising focused on a defined geographic area. It could move hundreds of people out of downtown, while homelessness remained visible elsewhere across Atlanta. Advocates estimated that roughly 1,000 other people were still unhoused beyond those already helped. This created a dangerous temptation. If success was measured mainly by how downtown looked during the tournament, the city could reach its visible objective, while the broader crisis continued outside the tourist corridor. Downtown Rising demonstrated that Atlanta was capable of building housing and moving people indoors. But the World Cup created a deadline for the city's image. Homelessness does not follow a tournament calendar. And as opening day approached, some people outside the program said they were not receiving apartment keys. They were receiving instructions to move. Benjamin Brown had been living on Atlanta's streets since 2017. He was 54, worked when contracting jobs were available, and earned extra money selling loose cigarettes. His life did not fit the easiest stereotype of homelessness. He was not waiting passively for someone to rescue him. He was working, surviving, and still unable to reach stable housing. In May 2026, Brown said police had told him and other unhoused people to leave downtown 3 separate times as World Cup preparations intensified. According to Brown, no apartment shelter placement or meaningful assistance accompanied those instructions. The message was simply that they had to move. Brown believed the tournament was driving the pressure. That was his interpretation, not proof of the city's internal motive. Atlanta officials said recent encampment actions were not connected to the World Cup, and police said they remained committed to maintaining a safe, orderly, and compassionate environment for everyone, including people experiencing homelessness. But the physical result was easier to verify. Reuters later found Brown about 2 miles from downtown in Mechanicsville. Around 25 other people were living there in tents, including children. The visible encampment had not vanished. It had moved beyond the area most visitors were likely to see. That distance may sound small on a map. For someone living outside, it can change everything. Moving can separate a person from the outreach worker who knows their name. It can place them farther from a bus route, a job, a clinic, or a place where they receive food. It can mean losing a familiar sleeping location, rebuilding protection from rain, and learning which threats appear after dark. Even when no property is destroyed, displacement consumes time and energy that could have gone toward escaping homelessness. This is why the phrase, "just move," hides so much. For a housed person, moving means transporting belongings from one address to another. For someone living in a tent, it may mean carrying every remaining possession without knowing where setting it down will be allowed. Brown's account did not erase the hundreds of people Atlanta had housed. Both realities could exist at the same time. One group received keys through a serious housing initiative. Another group remained outside, navigating police contact and repeated displacement as the tournament approached. The central question was no longer whether Atlanta had helped anyone. It clearly had. The question was what happened to everyone the program had not yet reached. And after the World Cup began, another cleanup raised a more troubling issue. People returned to a public park and said their tents, medication, and identification had disappeared. The city did not call it an encampment sweep. It called it routine maintenance. On July 1, a group of people returned to Freedom Park and discovered that much of what they owned was gone. For months, around 15 unhoused residents had gathered in one section of the park. It was less than a mile from a popular World Cup viewing area, but city officials said the location was not an encampment. That definition changed what happened next. According to residents and advocates, city workers arrived without warning and discarded tents, clothing, tools, identification documents, and medication. Reported losses included blood pressure pills, an insulin kit, and hormone medication. For someone with a home, replacing these items may be expensive and frustrating. For someone living outside, losing identification can block access to employment benefits, shelter, and housing. Losing a tent can mean losing the only protection available from rain. Losing insulin or other medication can become a medical emergency before the day is over. Atlanta's senior homelessness advisors said the operation was routine park maintenance, not an authorized encampment closure. Because the city did not classify the location as an encampment, officials said the warning and safety procedures created after Cornelius Taylor's death did not apply. Administratively, that distinction may have made sense inside a policy manual. On the ground, its consequences looked nearly identical to a sweep. People lost shelter, medicine, and documents. They were left with fewer resources and no obvious place to rebuild. The effect did not become less serious because the operation carried a different name. Advocates accused the city of using definitions to avoid the safeguards it had publicly adopted. Councilmember Kelsey Bond condemned the removal and began pursuing protections for people's belongings, while broader encampment policy was reconsidered. The city still had a legitimate responsibility to maintain public parks. Abandoned property waste blocked paths, and unsafe conditions cannot simply be ignored. But medicine identification and an occupied person's shelter are not ordinary litter. A humane policy requires workers to distinguish between trash and the last possessions keeping someone alive. This incident exposed a loophole larger than Freedom Park. A city may create careful procedures for official sweeps, but if the same protections disappear whenever an operation is called maintenance sanitation or park enforcement, the policy protects a category, not a person. And that is where Atlanta's World Cup record became hardest to judge. The city had invested in housing and helped hundreds of people indoors. It had also carried out an operation in which vulnerable residents said essential belongings vanished without warning. Both facts belonged in the final score. Now that the tournament was ending, the question was no longer what Atlanta promised before the cameras arrived. It was what remained after they left. The World Cup ended with Atlanta celebrating a successful performance on the global stage. More than 500,000 people attended the fan festival. Mercedes-Benz Stadium welcomed a similar number of match spectators. Trains carried millions of riders, hotels filled, and the city completed its largest international event since the 1996 Olympics. But the homelessness scorecard was more complicated. Downtown Rising had placed nearly 500 people into housing before the tournament. New rapid housing properties opened. Outreach teams expanded their hours, and Partners for Home said 24 dedicated workers would continue operating downtown for another year. Those are meaningful outcomes. A deadline created for a sporting event helped unlock money apartment staff and political urgency that might otherwise have taken longer to arrive. The strongest criticism of Atlanta is not that it did nothing. It is that the visible transformation moved faster than the public evidence of long-term stability. The reporting available after the tournament still did not clearly answer how many downtown Rising residents remained housed after 6 or 12 months. It did not show how many returned to shelters or the street. It did not establish whether people displaced from Freedom Park received replacement identification medication or a stable place to stay. And downtown was only one part of Atlanta. A city can reduce street homelessness in a tourist district while encampments grow in neighborhoods beyond the stadium, convention hotels, and television routes. From the perspective of a visitor, the crisis appears smaller. From the perspective of a person pushed 2 miles away, almost nothing has changed. That is why Atlanta's results should be judged through 4 questions. Are people still housed after the initial placement? Are fewer residents becoming homeless in the first place? Can people outside the downtown target area reach the same assistance? And when a public space is cleared, does every person leave with somewhere safer to go? Atlanta deserves credit for choosing housing as a major part of its response. The city built units, funded services, and demonstrated that political urgency can produce more than arrests and temporary fencing. But credit is not the same as closure. The World Cup gave Atlanta a fixed date and an international audience. Homelessness offers neither. It continues after the stadium lights go dark, after outreach hours return to normal, and after public attention moves to another city. The real test will come months later, when there is no tournament to prepare for and no global camera to impress. If the housing remains funded, the outreach workers remain in place, and the people who received keys are still indoors, the World Cup may have accelerated genuine reform. If investment slows while encampments simply reappear farther from downtown, then Atlanta will have improved the frame without changing the full picture. The tournament is over. The final score on homelessness has not been recorded yet. The stadium lights are off now. The crowds have gone home. The temporary barriers are being removed, and Atlanta has returned to ordinary life. But ordinary life is exactly where this story must be judged. The city had every right to keep sidewalks, parks, and public spaces safe. Residents, workers, patients, and visitors should not be forced to navigate dangerous conditions. Encampments marked by waste, fire risk, blocked paths, or violence cannot simply be ignored. But removing a tent does not remove the need to sleep somewhere. Atlanta deserves credit for building housing, expanding outreach, and helping hundreds of people move indoors. Those actions mattered. They gave some residents more than temporary relief. They gave them a door, a bed, and a chance to rebuild. Yet the people left outside also matter. If someone is moved from downtown to another neighborhood, the crisis has not ended. If medicine and identification disappear during a cleanup, the operation is not harmless. And if housing placements are celebrated without tracking whether people remain housed, success is still incomplete. The World Cup gave Atlanta a deadline. It also gave the city an opportunity. Whether that opportunity becomes lasting reform will depend on what happens next, whether funding continues, whether outreach reaches people beyond downtown, and whether every future closure ends with a safer destination instead of another forced move. Atlanta may have cleaned the frame. The real question is whether it changed the picture. So what do you think? Did the World Cup accelerate a humane solution or simply make homelessness harder to see? Disclaimer. This documentary is for educational and journalistic purposes only. It discusses homelessness, poverty, mental health, addiction-related issues, housing policy, and public spending. Composite characters are based on patterns from public records, housing research, shelter data, court filings, and published case studies. They are not intended to identify any specific private individual. This video does not promote illegal activity, drug use, harassment, or harmful behavior. Some footage has been edited or blurred for privacy, safety, and compliance with YouTube community guidelines.